Welcome back to our MSNBC special on impeachment, now entering the public phase for the first time, which means public hearings. And if the House impeaches, a public trial of President Trump. Now, when the president is on trial, the Senate handles this. That means the case against him is not made by a special counsel. Ken Starr did testify against Bill Clinton, but didn't present the case in the Senate. And the case is not made by, say, other prosecutors or the attorney general. They are obviously still the president's employees. The case is made by members of the House who go over to the Senate to lead the impeachment charge. Meaning, if the House impeaches, you will see even more of Adam Schiff, the Intelligence Committee chair, who has swiftly become one of the most famous people in Washington and also a major target of Trump's allies.
Adam Schiff is not a prosecutor.
Chairman Schiff running this one-sided, a Soviet-style scam.
I'm sorry, Adam Schiff is not an independent counsel.
Schiff emphasizes the Ukraine scandal has required Congress to do the work of an independent counsel that a normally independent prosecutor at the Justice Department would do.
It has forced the Congress to do the initial investigative work that normally a special counsel would do.
In the Clinton and Nixon cases, Congress did rely on these special counsels to get the basic facts of those scandals. Special Prosecutor Jaworski providing the investigation and Watergate roadmap for the House Judiciary Committee. Ken Starr giving Congress 18 boxes of evidence, famously unloaded for the Congress against Bill Clinton, and a 450-page report with 11 possible grounds for impeachment. Most recently, it was Bob Mueller emphasizing that while he couldn't indict Trump for obstruction, he would pass his report with the evidence of those incidents of obstruction to this very same Congress. And that brings us to the big difference here. There was a Russia special counsel. There is not one for Ukraine. And Bill Barr rushed to announce he was not investigating this scandal, an unusual move that actually may have backfired by pushing Congress to act even more swiftly because, well, there's no probe to wait on. Well, Adam Schiff is not waiting. He's now wearing these two hats. He's doing the investigative work, gathering the documents, text messages, the emails, interviewing the witnesses behind closed doors so they can't conspire and try to match up a cover-up story. And also, he's moving into the more traditional domain of Congress here that we've been discussing tonight, the public hearings that, at least on their best day, are supposed to enlighten America and provide accountability. Now, that is a lot for one committee chair to handle. But this is what I want to get into with you right now. It's pretty interesting. Mr. Schiff actually has a lot more experience with this first role than most members of Congress, having worked in the hard-charging legal post as a federal prosecutor before. 6 years in California, handling all kinds of cases, including some that are newly relevant, like government misconduct and national security. Then a younger Schiff convicting a former FBI agent for abusing his power, giving information to the Soviet Union. Now, impeachments are different than a traditional prosecutorial case. In fact, the Senate has only had 9 impeachment trials for any officials in the last century, which makes it especially striking that we looked into this and Mr. Schiff has ties to 2 of them. He won his seat by ousting a Republican who led the impeachment case against Bill Clinton at his Senate trial. The LA Times noting that the district shifted against Republicans as impeachment haunted the race. And as luck would have it, Congressman Schiff soon became the first floor manager for the first federal impeachment since that Clinton case. He marched over to the Senate to make the impeachment case against a sitting judge.
This morning, a special Senate committee opened its first impeachment trial since the 1999 case against former President Bill Clinton. This time, it's the trial of U.S. District Judge Thomas Protaras Jr. The New Orleans judge is facing 4 charges involving payoffs, kickbacks, and lying under oath.
Payoffs, kickbacks of a government official, it's all in the ballpark of bribery, which, of course, is an impeachable offense. Now, as a floor manager or something like a prosecutor, Schiff stressed how rare and how serious an impeachment is.
The House recognizes what an extraordinary proceeding this is and how seldom an impeachment is undertaken. The judge has committed a serious violation of the public trust. That in the phraseology of Governor Morris, one of the framers, that the judge has so misdemeaned himself by violating the public trust that it necessitates his removal from the bench.
Is this removal required to remedy an abuse of power? Well, that's the core question of most impeachments. And in contrast to other members of Congress in both parties right now, Schiff has actually presented this entire case in the U.S. Senate, spending days as the floor manager in that case I'm telling you about, from outlining evidence to questioning witnesses. In the unique circumstances, though, where courtroom skills aren't really deployed in court, but rather are in the U.S. Senate, for that impeachment, the senators fill the role of both jurors and judge. And the senator who presided over this judicial impeachment trial is my next guest, Claire McCaskill. She can speak to the rare precedent in history, a Senate impeachment trial, and to Mr. Schiff's abilities in this crucial role.
I think we have. I think we've conducted a proceeding that will stand the test of time, and I think everyone on the committee should be proud for the commitment they've made to this process. I think it's an important one for our democracy.
Senator, thanks for doing this.
You bet. My pleasure.
So striking to see all of that. What jumps out to you?
Well, it was. I have to admit, as I look back on my time in the Senate, it's a special chapter because I knew I was engaged in something that very few senators ever participate in, a full-blown impeachment trial along with a full vote of the Senate after the trial occurred. So I was honored to be part of it. It was done in a very bipartisan way. Unfortunately, it appears what we're dealing with these days is not so bipartisan. But I think justice prevailed and the judge was removed. And it was great to be able to rule on hearsay objections.
Well, that's always fun. You say justice prevailed in your view. That also means in this instance that Schiff won, which goes to the able case he put forward as well as the underlying evidence. Let's take a little bit more of a look at how he argued before you.
None of this he denies. Not the lunches, not the parties, not the favors, not the cash, not the false statements. The issue in this case is largely this. Judge Porteous doesn't believe any of this conduct is wrong. He doesn't believe any of it is unethical or immoral.
What did you learn about Congressman Schiff's ability to step into that role of a House impeachment manager, a central prosecutor?
Well, I spent a lot of time in a courtroom with juries, not shuffling paper. I did dozens and dozens and dozens of criminal trials, many of them by myself. That was back in the days where you didn't have a second chair in criminal trials in the late 70s and 80s as an assistant DA in Kansas City. I was immediately struck that he knew his way around the courtroom. He knew how to marshal his arguments. He knew how to stay on point. He didn't blather on. He knew when to object when it was meaningful, and he knew when to let something that was objectionable go and not slow down the process and irritate everyone.
And you're speaking to, that really goes more to style. There's all the rules of evidence. There are going to be rules that are agreed upon if and when there's a Senate trial here. You're also speaking to his judgment, his temperament.
Exactly. And when you try a case, what you're doing is you are making sure the facts speak. And if you're the prosecutor, you want to get out of it the facts way. You don't want to interfere with the facts. He did a very good job of letting the facts speak. And that's why I believe if he is the manager in the trial, I don't know yet who the manager would be if the House does impeach and it comes to the Senate for a trial. But if he is the manager, I'm confident that he will not let that team get off into extraneous details or try to argue about something that's not part of the most important fact pattern that establishes the abuse of power of the president.
Did this trial, because it did touch on alleged abuses of power, did it also say anything about how you defend effectively against those? Well,
it was interesting. They really, the defense team tried to basically say, this really isn't this big a deal. And I will tell you, as a humorous note, I'll never forget, Orrin Hatch was my co-counsel, was my co-chairman. So he was also a judge with me. And after the opening statement was over, he leaned over to me and he goes, well, this is going to be interesting. I don't think I've ever heard lap dance in a Senate hearing room before. So there was allegations involving improprieties of money changing hands and entertainment, changing hands.
Things that the judge got pursuant to his official role.
Correct. That lawyers were paying for things, meals, gratuities. lap dances for his son and maybe even for him. I don't remember. I just remember that lap dances were part of the evidence. And so the evidence, and there were other things they could have gotten into, but they really kept it marshaled on the facts they could prove. And I think the defense team just tried to say, this is a good man. It's not that bad. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. And the Senate obviously eventually voted. I think the vote was something like 92-2 or something to remove him from office. It was a pretty convincing case.
It's so fascinating getting this right from you, given your unique experience. I would say Senator McCaskill, or in this case, Juror McCaskill, which in our system sometimes is the most important role you can play.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you, Ari.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.